Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I thought I might delve a little bit deeper into the discussion or the idea of equating tarot with language. I know that I'm not the first person to create this sort of analogy between tarot and language, but it is a comparison that I find is very helpful and handy for me in my personal practice, in client readings when I'm trying to explain the way that the tarot works or the messages that I'm interpreting, and in tarot teaching and workshop settings when I'm trying to help somebody to better understand how the tarot might work as a structure for them. I think part of this is inspired by my educational background in English literature and communication studies. So both the written and spoken word are very important areas of life for me, and debatably maybe the few areas that I feel qualified to speak on in any capacity. Likewise, in recent weeks, I have been teaching and tutoring students in the evenings, and something that I found to be really interesting is tuning in or paying more attention to the way that we as humans, especially in our more formative years, learn and become fluent in language. Especially with the younger kids, we have a lot of activities and testing and sort of a way of teaching that very much integrates the idea of fluency. So that is being able to understand, communicate, read, write, speak a language at any given level. I know that that's going to vary across the world, and in some areas there's an emphasis on 2 languages or more. Here in the US it's primarily English, and we're just trying to get all of the kids up to speed with being able to speak, read, and write in that capacity. But seeing how that's measured and what sort of skills are important for the foundations of being fluent in a language made me start to think a little bit differently about my tarot practice and the way that I think of it as a language. So trying to better understand the way that I read the cards and maybe fluent in reading the cards. I have a few exercises that I want to touch upon, or things that I think might be fun to experiment with the cards. So I'm going to get to that in just a moment, but I thought I'd first maybe ramble around or start a bit more of a dialogue about what it means to maybe be fluent in the tarot, fluent and using tarot as a sort of language. So when we think of language in general growing up, I know most of us don't necessarily remember learning the idea of language or becoming fluent in any given language in our younger years, and I think the process of adopting a language in later years is a bit different. Having at least one language to be fluent in at a younger stage in life is really important in order to communicate, to find and create bonds, to be able to express ourselves. All of those things are important. And when we're reading the cards, using the sort of benchmarks and ideas that we equate with fluency in language, I think is really helpful. So I often find myself comparing individual cards to words or phrases, a series of cards, for example, to sentences or paragraphs, and reading them in connection to one another. And I think using fluency as a way to better understand yourself as a reader can be really helpful. For example, there are plenty of students, or those of us who in our beginning stages of tarot may have pulled 3 cards and read them completely separate as entities all on their own without actually making the connections between them. For example, when we're looking at fluency in a child or somebody who's learning a language, are you drawing connections between the words and reading them as a group? Are you comprehending what it is that you're reading, or are you just able to essentially understand the word in its basic essence? Do you understand the greater framework that's at play in, say, a paragraph? All of those things are going to be really important. So of course we start with things like basic words or phrases, and just understanding, being able to speak, to read those, to understand what a word might be. You start with the single card pull, and then when you get to those bigger settings where there is sort of a proficiency in the language, you want to be able to connect various words and phrases to create greater meaning. Now, there are some key differences in tarot and most languages that I do want to touch upon and I think are important. One, there is sort of a prerequisite to have a foundational language in order to use tarot. Tarot is more of a visual language or a visual tool, and you aren't fully capable of using, communicating, understanding the tarot without some sort of prerequisite language. There are written words. You need to be able to think about the cards through the context of written and verbal words, and if you are reading for yourself and others, that verbal communication can be really important. However, I would say it's not necessarily a must, and that's where we get more of that intuitive side of things in the way that you might imagine connotation and denotation. Denotation being more so that strict definition. You understand from a book context what this card means. Connotation being more of the implied meaning, where emphasis and mood and tone are going to be important. Being able to branch off of very definitive definitions is important, and both of those are, in my opinion, arguably very important in tarot reading. You need to be able to go beyond the strict rote definition of any of these cards and create more from them, in the same way that one word can mean multiple things depending on the context, the use, the inflection. A card can mean arguably just as many things, if not more. And I think part of the beauty of tarot is that there is an infinite amount of meanings, where there are very hard and fast rules when it comes to different languages. When it comes to the cards, we can sort of bend and mold and create our own rules. There may be multiple meanings for a word, but there are limits on how we can use a word and when we use that word. But with the cards, that's not necessarily the case, so there is this sort of freedom. But with that freedom can come a great degree of confusion. I think sometimes when we have a world of options, it can seem overwhelming, and I think that that's also the case when we look at something as wonderful and diverse and complicated as a tarot card. So something that I find with a lot of my students in tarot classes and workshops is when we get to reading more than one single card on its own, that there is this sort of desire or propensity to read the cards in isolation. And I see this with a lot of readers. I found this with myself, and I think it's a tendency that a lot of us can start to fall into if we're not watching ourselves as we read or paying active attention to what we're doing. You read the card, and then you read the next card, and then you read the next card, but you're not necessarily connecting the cards to create a combined meaning. They're not playing off of each other. There's no real attention paid to the relationship between the words or the phrases or the cards, and that's really important. When you're reading a paragraph, you're not going to just read the word and see the word say terrifying, and that's it. Imagine the rest of the sentence talks about how something is comforting, but this is terrifying. You don't want to necessarily misinterpret what's going on because you couldn't draw or create the connection or the relationship between the cards on the table. And to me, that starts to show proficiency in a reader, and a reader of words and a reader of cards is when you can make those parallels and draw the connections and read these in tandem as a sort of joint sort of meaning. I think that that's really important. And of course, when you get to these larger spreads or where you're drawing a bunch of cards, it's really important to be able to refer back to what you've read. So that reading comprehension, the idea that you actually understand in a critical way what it is that you're reading, is important. So you might know what the Prince of Cups means in the Book of Thoth. You might be able to recite a definition, but do you understand how you can apply that to your life and in the context of a reading what it might be speaking about? All of that's really important, and that shows more of that critical thinking side that accompanies language, the ability to transpose it and think abstractly about ideas. There's implied meaning, you're not getting necessarily it's served for you on a silver platter. You kind of have to delve, read between the lines, make assertions and findings for yourself that are not going to be very straightforward. You might find that there's a non-traditional or more artistic, intuitive way to interpret the way the words are combined, the same way that we would see a poem, for example, where it's not prose, it's not meant to be following any sort of structure, but it's communicating a feeling, an emotion. It might create sort of visualization. There might be some sort of figurative language going on that's not super direct. And all of that is going to come after a sort of basic proficiency in a language or in the cards. So that's why I think it's really important to have that book study when it comes to the cards. Of course, it's not mandatory. It's not mandatory to look at a sheet of paper and understand what all of the words mean. You could come up with your own imaginative idea for what a story is all about without understanding any of the words. I would say that it does show that maybe you don't understand the words, you don't have the background critical knowledge, you don't have necessarily maybe the more analytical or cognitive side of reading down. You might have a really active imagination, a really strong level of intuition, but I think it's kind of lost on the fact that you don't understand the actual meanings of the words. Likewise, you might be a really analytical person who can understand this system inside and out, be able to tell me about the majors, the minors, the quarts, but you don't have and you haven't really exercised that imaginative, intuitive thinking that goes beyond the written word and its definition. And in that case, it's sort of a shame, for example, that you might understand the paragraph or the card itself, but be missing the point entirely because you can't push yourself beyond the definition. And that's where I start to see or believe that intuition and background or sort of more book knowledge, cognitive, critical, analytical knowledge on the cards are equally important. I think that we're doing ourselves a service if we make concerted efforts to develop both of those sides of our fluency in tarot as a language. I think fun exercises to test this and to strengthen this way of working with the cards might be to partner up with somebody and maybe have them ask you a question verbally and to answer that question with the cards. You could say, or I could ask you, for example, how are you doing today? And the way that you answer would not be through language. You wouldn't verbally answer me, but you might say, you might answer with one card, the Hermit, and that might, for me, mean something, and I'm supposed to interpret what it is you're communicating to me. Are you feeling lonely today? Are you feeling isolated? Are you feeling introspective? You might take that up a notch and answer with a sort of sentence or something a little bit more complex. If you feel like you're up for it, how are you feeling today? I might pull out these three in tandem and try to read them as a combined message rather than just saying, okay, so you feel like you're lacking. There might be some stressors on you in your tangible world. You're also feeling really motivated. You're ready to go out and do something. You're feeling very active despite this pressure. It's inspiring you. Oh, and you're feeling a little bit emotional. Okay, I get it. I read all of those separately. How do we read them together? It might be that you're lacking is creating this sort of fire under you. So we're now creating a sort of story. You're feeling a very deep emotion, or you're feeling raw emotion based on this lacking, and all of that is maybe feeding into this personality or this way that you're choosing to present yourself to the world today. You know, we're getting more complex messages when we start to draw the relationship and find the relationship between the words rather than reading the words on their own. So that's a good one. You might actually decide to ask a question with the cards. So instead of responding with the tarot, I might say to you, or I might say, you might know that I'm going to ask you a question, or I might be communicating to you and I go, how are you interpreting that? What am I asking you? Am I asking you how you're feeling inspired today? Am I asking you how you might be able to go out into the world and create something? What am I asking you? And so you might then reiterate to me my question to illustrate your understanding or your comprehension of the language that I'm giving to you. Are you able to comprehend essentially what it is that's on the page or the words being provided for you? Again, you could take that up a notch, and I could just hold these cards up to you without any context, and you interpret them for me, letting me know what it is I'm asking or trying to say to you. This might be a more frantic, upbeat message. We've got a lot of colors going on. Bring in that intuitive side. Don't necessarily just go for those book meanings, or find a middle ground, I guess, would be also a great way to do it. But when I emphasize, for example, in some of my videos, I have a video on the Thoth, and I think I'm a little bit harsh in saying that there needs to be some level of reading done or understanding of the system of the Golden Dawn and the Thoth in order to get the most out of this deck. It's because you want to understand what the words actually mean in a language before you start to get into that tone or area where there's a mood and you're understanding the feelings. It's like I could read the sentence and just decide it means I'm happy today, but the words themselves in definition might be saying I'm terrified or I'm uncomfortable. But because I don't read that language, I'm not fluent enough in the definitions of the words, my mood, my imagination is not enough for me to fully understand what it is I'm presented with and to communicate effectively based on that. Likewise, the sentence might say, I'm happy, but if I read it in the greater context of the paragraph, it might be sarcastic. And if I don't have the imagination, if I don't have the sort of emotional intelligence or way of understanding inflection, I'm not going to understand that that doesn't actually mean what it's saying, that it means something a bit separate, and that I need to sort of make this more abstract leap into the realm of language in order to fully get the most out of what I'm reading or see it for what it really is by reading in between the lines. Likewise, I've been holding up the TOEFL, a more structured system of tarot, and in some ways I view the more major systems that have been established as dialects in some ways, and that's why I think it's really fun to study the tarot and the different systems. Of course, I can take this and read it as if it were the Rider-Waite-Smith or the Marseille, but that doesn't make it so. It was made with a certain series of meanings in mind. There is literature out there to explain that and to teach what exactly this is in its own right, the same way that I would pick up the Marseille. And yes, I could take this and read this Ace of Wands in the same way that I would read the Ace of Wands in the Rider-Waite-Smith, but it's not intended to be read in that way. I might see the same word in British English, I guess you could say, or a slang word, or just the way that they're speaking. Doesn't mean that that same sentence is going to mean the same thing in America or the United States or American English. So I think all of that's really interesting. The way that you might pick up different tone, there might be different nuances to different systems. For me, I find that really fun because it means I have more to work with. I can pick up the top and get the same 3 cards but have an entirely different message. Likewise, of course, with all language, the same sentence can mean a myriad of things depending on the context and the day, so I can get the same 3 cards 3 days in a row, and they could also mean something completely different based on my setting, what I have going on in my life, the same way that language is going to have a similar effect depending on the day. I could tell you that I'm okay today, and you know what I have going on. I could tell you that I'm okay tomorrow, and I could be at a funeral, and you know I'm just trying to put on a brave face, or I really just want to stop the conversation there and prevent you from inquiring further. It really depends on the setting, the same way. I know that's a little dark, but just to set an example. So I think that that's just a really fun way of looking at the tarot, and based on my recent experiences in trying to better understand and teach fluency to children, understanding what we look for and how there is this very measurable way to look at language and fluency in language, and then also transposing that onto my tarot studies. I just thought I would share my personal little machinations going on in my head and see if anybody else finds this to be useful or helpful or fun. Likewise, I think that those tarot exercises instead of using the written word or the verbal word, exercising your language skills with tarot and answering and asking questions with the tarot, maybe even creating a story out of the cards. All of those are things that I use personally in my tarot classes and workshops to build a fluency in tarot, and it is why I really do try to nail in that some level of book learning, of memorization, of study is helpful for fluency in tarot just as much as the intuitive, imaginative side is. And I know that nobody likes to study in the same way that you're not going to want to have to sit down and read definitions and learn vocabulary and learn to speak, but you're not going to get to that level of mastery if you're not actually putting in the effort or the work. So I'd like to know what you all think about this topic, tarot as a language, tarot and language being equated with each other, and the two having a lot of similarities if you ask me, but of course there are differences, with tarot being more of this visual tool that requires some level of prerequisite language in order to be properly or competently used, I would argue. That being said, I'm sure there are exceptions. So like and subscribe if this was fun or interesting, and until next time, bye.